Weeks after New York City had its first mayoral primary election using ranked choice voting, a proposal has been made to bring the system to the nation's capital.
Now, the bill was introduced last week by D.C. Council member Christina Henderson and would implement ranked choice voting in 2024. A similar proposal was introduced back in 2019, but it didn't ever receive a hearing. Joining us now to discuss are Democratic strategist Michael Starr Hopkins and Real Clear Politics reporter Philip Wegman. Welcome to you both.
Good morning.
So, Philip, you're in D.C. What do you think the likelihood of this actually being implemented is?
I don't know the likelihood of it actually being implemented, but I love the idea of just ranked choice voting coming to DC, not working well. You have the city trying to figure out who actually, won this or that city council race or even a mayoral race. And it's not going to be just like New York, where you have people with real jobs going about their business. Instead, it'll be DC, where you have, everyone and their brother who has a, political science degree just weighing in constantly. And I think that will lead to some pretty interesting chaos. Look, ranked choice voting, in principle, isn't a terrible idea. It seems. I mean, certainly. Both Republicans and Democrats, they do similar things at their conventions, right? When they figure out who's going to be their presidential nominee. Have there been hiccups, pretty significant hiccups like the one we saw in New York? Yeah. And it behooves the people in charge that if they're going to change the system, that they do it efficiently so people can have confidence in the vote.
So, Michael, did New York screw this up for everybody by botching the kind of rollout of RCV, or do you think the fact that in the end, they figured it out and people actually did seem to understand it and take it up at the polls according to exit polls?
Yeah, I mean, I think initially they really botched it, but it was less about the ranked voting and more about just a really inept election board and an election system that was set up there. And so I think people got very confused and thought it was because of the ranked voting system being implemented that there was such chaos. They were just plain out incompetent. And so I think should this happen in D.C., Philip hit the nail on the head. Now you're just going to have a bunch of smart-ass, poli-sci students explaining to everyone why it's good or why it's horrible. But it's going to be really fun to watch because I vote in Maryland, so...
Yeah, that's actually going to be great for you, Michael. You'll just watch the chaos unfold just right across the border. Yeah.
Mark your calendar for 2024.
Well, you're touching on something really interesting, actually, both of you. And to Phil's point about how political scientists would just latch on to this and have a field day sort of explaining in their nerdy voices with their pocket protectors how this is so important, that this is the better way to do it, this is more efficient. How do you think that argument plays? I mean, this is actually a movement. I mean, that's the only way to say it at this point. That's sort of coming across the entire country. They're talking about it back in my home area in Wisconsin. How do you think this plays with the public?
I'll take this one.
Go for it.
Yeah, go for it.
Oh, sorry.
I think it's going to be really interesting. I think back to that Florida gubernatorial election where Andrew Gillum managed to squeak his way through the primary. And the only reason he was able to do so is because it was such a loaded field and you could win the primary with 27 to 30% of the vote. You put ranked voting in there, and there is no Andrew Gillum. And I think that that's going to be true in places all over the country where kind of small-funded, charismatic candidates won't be able to break through because of ranked voting. So it's going to be interesting. For all the positives it has, I think it's also going to suppress some of the lesser-funded candidates.
Yeah, it's interesting because progressives and leftists are really the ones who are pushing ranked choice voting because they feel like for their entire lives they've been forced to vote for a lesser of two evils, so they don't accidentally pick the greater of the two evils, and this would allow them to vote their conscience, vote for Ralph Nader first, and then they pick
Biden.
And then they pick their next choice so that they don't accidentally elect George W. Bush, right? Yeah. But like you said, in the real world, it doesn't always benefit the progressive. In San Francisco, London Breed, running as the kind of establishment candidate, lost in the early rounds to a more progressive challenger, but then because more people consolidated around her in the later rounds, ended up winning the San Francisco mayoral race. So but maybe that's okay. Like maybe that is an expression of the voters' intent. I don't know. Where do you come down on Philip?
So the way I come down on this is I've got flashbacks from Iowa where we were so excited to figure out who was going to win the Democratic primary. And then turns out that entire state was buffering for like a week. We didn't know, right? So obviously my bias is towards whatever gives us the most accurate picture and answer immediately. But no, I mean, like, I think what's so interesting about this is like, there are people on the right too who are looking at ranked choice voting and they're saying, wait a minute, this might be a way for us actually to get a quality candidate through a primary rather than just someone who can have like a crazy viral moment and then, they sink in November. I think that in order to get a lot of momentum to make this work, maybe this isn't something that needs to happen in New York or DC or San Francisco. Make this work in Terre Haute, Indiana. Make this work in the heartland where you have people who are just like, hey, this is a fact of life. We can do this efficiently. It's not some high stakes, political science project. Instead, this works here. It can work somewhere else. Maybe the eyes of the nation being off of it for a second could benefit. But, that's just my 2 cents.
Yeah, I mean, I guess Terre Haute would be a little bit easier than New York City.
Right. Yeah, and interestingly, both Iowa and New York were disasters as a result of the same thing, cronyism. In New York, the Board of Elections is a place that you put your cousin. It's known as like a patronage spot because they never had competitive elections before. So it didn't matter if you had incompetent people who couldn't count. The Democrat was going to win 100-0. So how do you screw that up? In Iowa, the DNC hired some cronies to build an app and try to program some iPads. Didn't think it through, and the whole thing fell apart. So you not only have to like design the system effectively, but you then have to not just hand it off to your cronies.
Yeah. Well, good luck with that. Right. Thanks, guys, so much for your time.
Thank you.
We'll be back with more Rising right after this.